Good evening. I'm Abby Phillip in New York. Last week on this show, a guest shocked the table by arguing in part that slavery in America can't just be blamed on one race, and that museums put too much focus on the role of white people who participated in that terrible institution. And now tonight, that same argument is being pushed by the President of the United States. Donald Trump says that one of the reasons for his crackdown on Smithsonian museums is, quote, everything discussed is how bad slavery was. What we try to do on this program is create a platform for discussion and debate that reflects the very real differences that exist in this country. It's what echo chambers in our society fail to do, frankly. But on this topic, it's important to say objectively, slavery was indeed bad. It was evil, the nation's original sin. And it is impossible to understand the true history of this country without fully grappling with slavery's impact. Simply because of their birthplace and the color of their skin, the bodies and spirits of black men, women, and children were exploited for profit and power. They were forced onto ships, bound by shackles and collars that ripped off their skin. One older man described it as iron entering our souls. Some chose to jump into the waters infested with sharks rather than feel that iron. Now, once they arrived on this very soil, they were forced to work by way of the whip, despite being starved, sleep-deprived, threatened, tortured, physically and psychologically. They were auctioned off, humiliated, fearful, and separated from their families and their children. Black women and girls were raped and sexually assaulted. Many were brutally murdered and mutilated. Now, this endured for decades, centuries. And even in the places where slavery was not legal, institutions from our banks to universities were built on enslaved labor in both the North and in the South. And for many of the white Americans who did not personally own slaves, they benefited from a caste system that concentrated wealth and political power in their hands. So, when we acknowledge the existence of black people who operated George Washington's Mount Vernon or the black hands that built the White House, we are acknowledging the existence, the perseverance, and the contributions of the souls that white supremacy sought to erase. Those people built families, they developed a culture, they were the keepers of the faith, cultivators of community. And they are the ones who deserve credit for forcing America to rid itself of the stain of slavery. Now, all of this information, these stories are from the Smithsonian's African American History Museum. And I share this not as a lecture for you, but as a lesson. America, the superpower, is largely possible only because of the superpowers of people who went lifetimes without the same rights of generations who were boosted from their backs. True history should include everything. Yes, the evils and the horrors too. And museums are supposed to be places that protect those stories, the images, the lessons, the very things that inform so much of our current state of our republic, from racism to poverty. No matter how painful, or in the president's words, how horrible the lesson. Now, just listen to one formerly enslaved man describe what slavery is like in his own words.
You know what I'd rather do? If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog.
We are here in the studio with our panel, Leah Wright Rigueur. I was actually surprised to see President Trump basically saying the quiet part out loud, that this review of the Smithsonian is not about even just something vague about reviewing history to make sure that it's fair. He wants to make it so that it talks less about slavery. What does that say to you?
Well, I think it's an effort. It's part of a larger effort to both sanewash and whitewash American history, and essentially erase all of the parts and disappear all of the parts that make Americans, that make President Trump uncomfortable, that feel distasteful, that are a reflection of the actual real and horrific parts of our history. And I find it a little ironic. You know, earlier today, as I was listening to some of the commentary, my first thought was, wait a second. I wonder if the president has actually ever visited any of the Smithsonian museums. And then I remembered that in 2017, he actually took a tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Let me just play actually what he said during that tour. Listen to this.
I had the privilege of visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture right here in Washington, D.C. It's a new, beautiful Smithsonian museum that serves as a shining example of African Americans' incredible contributions to our culture, our society, and our history. It also tells of the great struggle for freedom and equality that prevailed against the sins of slavery and the injustice of discrimination. The work and love of the people who helped create such a masterpiece is a testament to the legacy of so many leaders it honors.
So was it that he didn't believe what he read from the teleprompter as he recorded that video, or what?
You know, I'm really struggling to understand in a lot of ways, particularly given that the tour that he took with director Lonnie Bunch was actually a reflection of really the mastery that and really the care and the patience that historians, that scholars, that curators put into the Museum of African American History and Culture. It is not just about the horrors of slavery, although it tells that very important story. It actually follows this really brilliant model where you move through the museum and it tells the story not just of enslaved Americans in America, but also of the resilience, of the triumph. And in doing so, it tells a story that is very much about democracy and about a quest for democracy and the way that Americans both built this country, but also the story and the narrative of like a truly American experience. And so for the president, I think, to just simply erase that and push that away tells it, particularly after praising it a few years ago, tells us that this is part of a much larger agenda. This is part of a much larger agenda to erase things that really, I think the country is just refuses to deal with and is really uncomfortable with.
He said as much by ending this post with, "This country cannot be woke because woke is broke." He says, "We have to have the hottest country in the world and we want people to talk about it, including our museums." Why is he equating talking about slavery with woke?
Well, look, I think, let me just start this conversation by saying that my personal view is slavery was a reprehensible institution. I agree with your words that it was our original sin. We also fought a war to eradicate it and to get over it as a country. And that was a necessary thing that happened, and a lot of people died, and we did eradicate it, and that's a good thing. I think what he's asking is, in our museums, what defines us? Are we going to be defined by the worst moment or the worst institution or the worst mistake we ever made? Or are we going to be defined by what we've done moving forward to get over it and to become the greatest nation on the earth? My belief is that he wants to look at these museums, not because he wants to do away with the idea that slavery occurred, but that he wants to ask a very simple question. Are we going to present ourselves as being exceptional or not? And I think he believes there is an effort by some to continue to try to define us from our worst moment instead of to try to focus and define us based on our best moments, which started when we eradicated slavery and began to move forward as the light of the world. And so that's what I think.
Museums, that's what makes us an exceptional nation, is because they tell the history and the story of our country, and therefore, you know, these horrible, horrific moments in our history, the original sin, as Abby talked about, when it comes to slavery, has we of course did eradicate it, but look where we've come today. And I think those museums, like to your point, make America exceptional, and in museums all around the world that document atrocities, whether it be, from Nazi Germany to eradicating slavery here in the United States, you have to learn the lessons of the past, and to deny it is to defend it.
I don't think he's denying it. And Batya may want to comment on this as well, but I think what he wants to ask is a simple question. As we present our history, are we spending most of our time focused on something terrible? Are we going to spend more time as we enter our 250th anniversary focused on what this country has done to improve the lives of every single person who lives here? We are the light of the world for a reason, because we're an improving commodity.
The question I ask when I hear you say that is, why? I mean, the idea that slavery happened, it's hard to understand what we've overcome if you don't even talk about what it was. I think that kind of waters down the whole.
I don't think anybody is proposing that we ignore that it happened. I don't think that's accurate.
I think that the problem is that there are people, and Scott used the term a couple of times, and I don't think it was meant with any type of ill intent, but he said, we got over it. And I think that's the problem. I think that there are a lot of people in this country who believe that for some reason we got over it. I mean, the fact is that American chattel slavery is vastly different than what Jillian Michaels and others talk about when they talk about slavery around the world. I mean, the chattel slavery system that we had was extremely transactional. It was actually codified in law, and it was based upon the color and race, as you so eloquently pointed out in your opening. And so not only when you think about that portion of where we are, 26 of our first 30 Supreme Court justices owned slaves. The people who are on our money every single day owned slaves. United States presidents, members of the United States Congress owned slaves. Lehman Brothers, we're not far from Wall Street, owned slaves. Brooks Brothers suits that we wear owned slaves. So not only are we talking about the epicenter and the foundation of where our country was built, we have to acknowledge that. But even more importantly, and this is where I believe that Scott and I can find agreement on this issue. Breon and Megan Walker, two of my best friends in the world, their dad was the first African-American SGA president at the University of South Carolina, right? He was an exec at IBM, but he was one of the first, right? We're still talking about first that emerged and stood on those shoulders. I tell the story often about my mom and dad. My mom helped desegregate high schools. In Hamilton High School in Memphis, Tennessee, my dad shot in the Orangeburg Massacre. This is a part of my story. This isn't some faint, distant history. Yeah. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think that American exceptionalism talks about the fact that Black folk enslaved folk help build this country for what it is. Mm-hmm. They built Washington, D.C., but all of us are around this table. Abby, myself, all of us, not just Abby and myself, all of us are around this table because of the sacrifices and the blood and the sweat and the tears these people poured in.
I also come back to why the focus so much on slavery when it comes to rewriting history. There's a lot of history that it's in these museums, but he's focused on one thing, and that is that there's too much slavery being mentioned in the United States of America. That's very odd, Batya, honestly.
So I want to start by saying I actually agree with everything that's been said, and I loved your opening. And so I offer these comments very humbly because it's an honor to be included in this conversation, which is very solemn, and I think we all understand that, and we are all looking for the common ground here. And so what I'm about to say, I don't mean in any way to negate that tone. But starting around 2011, 2012, sociologists started to notice a shift in white liberal opinion polling to where white progressives became more extreme in their views on race than Black and Hispanic Americans. And they called this, the sociologists called it the Great Awakening. And when they postulated, where did this come from? Why did white progressives suddenly start obsessing over race in a way that was actually far to the left of where Hispanic and Black Americans were on this issue? They found that the media had shifted radically how it talked about these issues. So for example, in 2010, the words white supremacy were mentioned 75 times in the Washington Post and the New York Times.
But the media is different from museums.
In 2020, the words white supremacy were mentioned 700 times in the Washington Post and the New York Times and 2,400 times in NPR. the word racism 4,000 times in 2020. The words white and racial privilege from 2013 to 2019 grew by 1,500% in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the word slavery itself exponentially skyrocketed as a percentage of words. I'm offering this only to suggest.
I understand. I'm just wondering
that.
What do you think is the problem with talking about slavery, white supremacy, racism, et cetera?
So the point I'm trying to make here is that liberals will say, well, this is a reflection of reality. But of course it isn't. This is a reflection of a newfound obsession that was driven by the media. And that doesn't reflect either the moral evil of these things or the historical accuracy.
I do want to dive into what you mean by that, because you say that you don't think it's a reflection of reality. Based on what?
Well,
based on the idea that those things don't exist, that white supremacy doesn't exist, racism doesn't exist, that we shouldn't be talking about it anymore?
Based on the idea, obviously all these things I think are evil, but there's not more slavery now to the tune of
but I think part of the problem,
than there was
Batya, is that in the
that's
hold on a second, Bakari. Part of the problem is that back, not that long ago, in the 50s, 60s, even beyond that, when there was actual Jim Crow happening in this country, people were actually treating black people as second-class citizens. We weren't talking about those things at all.
But in
those words were virtually never mentioned.
But Abby, you don't
so is
think
that better? Was it better then,
or
was it worse?
You don't think that 2013 is the same as the 1960s,
But you're missing,
right?
Respectfully, and I've had this debate many times.
Do you really think that there's as big a difference between the 1960s and 2013?
I don't. That's not my point. My point is that the use of the language in present day, or the lack of the use of the language back when racism was apparent every single day in the streets of America, doesn't reflect really anything except perhaps a better awareness of the reality that we live in as a country.
That's not the point.
Do you think the country was more racist in 2013?
That's not the point.
I didn't say anything about whether the country was more racist now.
We're missing the forest for the trees. Because what you have to realize is that the remnants of slavery that emerged through black codes, which, were enforced by what is modern day police, what you're talking about in Jim Crow, what you're talking about in the civil rights movement, those fights that weren't even 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. When you talk about George Elmore and everything he gave up so that African Americans could vote in the primary system, when you talk about Harry and Eliza Briggs, who actually were the foundation for Brown versus the Board of Education, when you're talking about Sarah Mae Fleming, who sat down on a bus before Rosa Parks, you're talking about the foundation of where we are today, and you see those remnants of injustice even as we sit here today. You have a quarter of shame in South Carolina. Scott just was in South Carolina along the I-95 corridor where black and brown kids go to school. Their heating and air don't work. You have hospitals that are shut down. You have redlining that affect black people today. You have USDAs, right? The Farm Subsidy Program, which wasn't allocating funds to black people. So yes, although you might want to say, and one of the most amazing things about Barack Obama was that we believed we were in this post-racial society. We are not. And so my point to you is that every ounce of change that we've ever had in this country has been because black blood flowed through the streets. You don't have the 64-65 Voting Rights Act without the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You don't have the Voting Rights Act. You don't have Fair Housing Act without King being assassinated. We don't even take the Confederate flag down without 9 people being killed in a church, right? We don't talk about criminal justice reform without a black man being killed in the streets. And so when we are articulating our views to you about the remnants thereof, I understand your point that we are not shackled or in bondage like we were in slavery. However, we have never deconstructed the remnants which still affect us today.
Well, I also want to just add, Batya, but Batya, just as a factual matter, I mean, you're talking about a time period in which there was the first black president elected in the country. There was the Mother Emanuel massacre that happened during his presidency, which was, last I checked, about racism and white supremacy. So there have been moments when we have actually correctly in this country grappled with those very things because they've been put on the agenda by our fellow Americans. So I don't understand the desire to try to avoid that when it's not as if it's gone. I mean, people are literally still killing people in this country because of the color of their skin, and suddenly we should just move past it?
I think we've had more than just moments where we have had massive leaps forward in the way we treat each other in this country. I mean, I agree with Batya. Where we sit today is vastly different than where we sat in the 1960s or the 1920s or the 1860s.
I don't think anybody's disputing that.
And it's not even close. It's
I
not
don't
even
know, but I don't
close.
think anybody's disputing that. I think it's just a question of, do we need to just stop talking about it because we're not in
I don't
Jim
think
Crow
anyone's
anymore?
proposing that, but what I do think he is proposing, and I think this is worth discussing, is that as we go into our 250th anniversary, how are we presenting ourselves to the world? Are we presenting ourselves as a country that is obsessed with our worst moment, or are we presenting ourselves as a country that managed to overcome our worst moment and have been improving ever since?
It's not about being obsessed with our worst moment. I mean, again, I think it's an important part. Last year, 17 million people visited the Museum for African American History and Culture. And I think that's an important number because part of what they saw was that this was a story about African American resilience. This is a story about community. It is a story about democracy and triumph. But it is also a story about two parts of the same coin that you can't have. And I think this is to Bakari's point, that you can't have that story of resilience. You can't have that story of expansive democracy without understanding how it happened and how we got there. You can't erase slavery and say, well, it's over and done with, and now we're not going to talk about it.
A quick moment, though, on Donald Trump's role in all of this, because I think that kind of gets glossed over. I mean, the idea that the president is saying that he is going to have his attorneys go through the museums the same way that he did the colleges and the universities is, as far as I can tell, not something that we've seen in this country in a very long time. And it's also something that deserves to be pointed out as not normal.
I think it's not normal, but also, is this a good use of time for the President of the United States to be doing this? I think you saw that clip in 2017 when he was praising the African American History Museum. He was talking about his tour and the visit. I'm not sure what changed from now until then. I'm not aware of other exhibits or other like language being inserted into anything that's being shown at the museum.
What's changed is the backlash on the right.
Yeah,
against anything that has to do with race. And he is leaning into that because that is where his political base is. But we also have a responsibility to the facts and to actual history, not just the version that suits us in this political moment.
I think that the president is throwing stuff against the wall even when he tweets stuff like this. And I think that you have to be cautious about discounting people for their remarks, particularly when you have the president of the United States. But coming from the South where I'm from, you don't have to necessarily read about your history in history books, which is fascinating, because you go to the barbershop and people tell you about when King came to town. I mean, people actually, they slept on jailhouse floors, they smelled the bullets come by, and so you have this griot type of culture. The danger, however, is not with Donald Trump, who's an 80-year-old man. And this is what we haven't tackled. The danger is with people like Dylan Roof, who had as much hate in his heart as Lester Maddox and other individuals during that time period. We have an entire generation who will discount that history. And I prefer, and I think this, kind of to your point, progressives and liberals and even people to the right, particularly now, have gone to this point where we don't want to have the free flow and exchange of ideas, where we cancel people who have ideas that are different from yours. And I think we have to get back to a point of having more education, more books, more museums, more history in those museums, more exchange of ideas so that we become a more educated country, because right now I feel like this country's dumb as hell.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Next for us, a red state is now giving teachers ideology tests to weed out the woke. Here are some of the questions that they're going to be asked. Plus, more Republican governors are sending their own troops to Washington, D.C. tonight to join Trump's takeover of the city. We'll debate that.